Informamos também que haverá tradução simultânea e os interessados podem solicitar o transmissor no hall de entrada deste auditório. E, neste momento, iniciaremos a mesa redonda de tema, a concorrência tributária sob o ângulo da neutralidade dos impostos de mercado, ICMS, IPI, ISS e IVA. A mesa está assim constituída. Como presidente, o professor Walter de Souza Lobato. E os conferencistas, professor Bev Dalby, doutor José Benedito Miranda e professor Eduardo Maneira. Anunciamos agora a palavra do presidente de mesa, advogado, professor de Direito da Faculdade de Direito Milton Campos, diretor da ABRADT, professor Walter de Souza Lobato.
Boa tarde a todos. Bem-vindos a esse painel do Congresso. Esse painel especificamente vai tratar da concorrência tributária, da concorrência fiscal e do princípio da neutralidade dos impostos de mercado, enfatizando que diversos são os fatores que impedem que os tributos de mercado tenham total neutralidade. Entre eles, a concorrência fiscal. Então, nós escolhemos 3 conferências que procuram abordar esses diversos fatores. Primeiro, o professor Bev Dalby vai falar da possibilidade ou não da coexistência de 2 tributos de mercado, e é uma experiência canadense, tributos cumulativos ou não. Depois, o professor José Benedito Miranda, procurador da Fazenda Estadual, falará sobre os incentivos fiscais do ICMS, à luz da jurisprudência recente do Supremo Tribunal Federal. E, finalmente, o professor Eduardo Maneira vai trazer esses outros fatores que impedem a neutralidade dos nossos impostos de mercado ou tributos de mercado. Entre eles, ICMS, IPI, ISS, PIS e COFINS. Passar a palavra aos conferencistas.
Então, para falar sobre a experiência do Canadá com o IVA federal e os impostos sobre o consumo das províncias, viabilidade do modelo canadense na área de livre comércio, nós convidamos o professor Bev Dalby. Professor de Economia da Universidade de Alberta, no Canadá, PhD pela Escola de Economia de Londres, especialização em impostos e tributação, experiências no Banco Mundial, no FMI e no Governo do Canadá. Em 2004, foi professor visitante da Fundação Getúlio Vargas, no Rio de Janeiro. Senhoras e senhores, professor Bev Dalby.
Primeiro, eu quero agradecer ao professor Isabel por convidar-me a esta conferência. Segundo, quero fazer uma apologia porque meu português é mau. Ano passado, eu fui à Fundação Getúlio Vargas, no Rio. Fui no Rio porque eu tenho coração brasileiro. Seu nome é Mary Clementina dos Santos, ela é carioca. Eu gosto de dizer, eu tenho coração brasileiro e Mary tem uma cabeça canadense. Este ano, Mary estuda inglês no Edmonton, no Canadá. Em casa, nós falamos inglês. Por isso, eu falo português mal. Mas nós compramos apartamento pequeno na Tijuca, no Rio. Cada ano nós vamos voltar a Tijuca, porque eu amo Tijuca, Rio e Brasil. Eu espero que melhorar meu português e conhecer mais do país formoso. Now I will have to continue in English. Thank you. I have been asked to speak about the Canadian experience with a dual VAT system or multiple sales tax system, and whether this can exist or survive in a free trade area. And the short answer is not only can it survive, but it's necessary in our free trade area. Because basically we have two free trade areas, one within Canada, between the provinces, and a second between Canada and the United States. And in fact, the second is almost as important as the first. So the next slide, please. I will begin with an overview of the taxes that are imposed by Canadian governments, especially at the federal and state or provincial level. It's, I think, necessary to give you an overview in order to understand the importance of sales taxes and what reform of our system will mean. I want to stress the interdependence of our tax system, and this is important for the reform of our tax system. It turns out that the dual VAT system that has evolved in Quebec is a model that could be followed by other countries in the world, but also should be followed by other provinces in Canada. And I will outline briefly a reform that I'm proposing for sales taxes in Canada. Next slide, please. An important characteristic of the Canadian Federation is that it is highly decentralized. The provinces in Canada have enormous tax power, basically as much tax power or ability to levy taxes as the federal government. And they use that power to raise a substantial amount of tax revenue. Canada and Switzerland are the most decentralized countries in the world in terms of the amount of tax revenue raised at the subnational or provincial state level. And so we have provinces with enormous tax powers. This is necessary because of the way Canada has evolved. The government of Quebec, as many of you will know, is predominantly a French-speaking province, and they have wanted to maintain or preserve independence. And to be independent, even within Canada, they need substantial tax powers. And now the other provinces have also adopted this view. So we have a country with a high degree of tax decentralization. I want to stress that it's not revenue sharing, a system of revenue sharing. That is, there isn't a tax that's levied and then divided up among the provinces. There is some of that, but in the main, the provinces are responsible for defining the tax base, setting the tax rates, and depending on the tax, also administering the collection of the tax. Next slide, please. So I know you had a brief lesson in Canadian geography this morning with Professor McMillan. I'm going to give you another brief one. In this slide, I show the 10 provinces. We have 10 provinces and 3 territories. The 3 territories are the northern territories, very small in terms of population, very big in terms of area. From west to east, then, we have British Columbia, which is on the Pacific coast, a lot of links with Asia, a large percentage of the population in Vancouver, the capital or the main city, are Chinese or Asian descent. The second province from west is Alberta. That is where Professor McMillan and I are from. We have about 10% of the population. Alberta has substantial oil and gas revenues. In Canada, the resource revenues belong to the provincial governments. The state of Rio would be very rich if it was in Canada. We supply 20% or 25% of the oil and natural gas that the United States consumes. We have mineral oil sands reserves that exceed Saudi Arabia. We will be, if the price continues at $60 a barrel, producing a lot of oil from these reserves. So because of this, we are relatively rich in terms of fiscal capacity. The next province is, in fact, where I was born, Saskatchewan, about 1 million people, agricultural province, although it also has some substantial mineral resources in the northern part of the province. Manitoba, another province, primarily agricultural, about 1 million people, 3.7% of the population. The largest province is Ontario, with almost 40% of the population. It is the manufacturing base of Canada, the financial center, with very close links with the United States. The automobile industry is highly integrated with the United States. I should say that Canada is extremely open economy, and trade is very important. 80% of our trade goes with the United States. 80% of that trade is within company trade, intra-company trade, between two branches of the same company. So we are in a very important or delicate tax competition position, not only between states, but with the United States. Quebec, it has about 25% of the population. 80% of the people in Quebec, their mother tongue is French. They want to have as much independence as possible. Some of them would even like to have their own country. So we have had 2 major referenda over whether they should separate. And it's an ongoing and probably never-ending problem. The other provinces are in eastern Canada. They are small in size and also relatively small in population. So the one thing that we have is a huge diversity in terms of sizes of provinces, diversity in terms of economic base, and many of the most important economic links are north-south, that is between the United States and the adjacent province. Alberta sells more to the United States than we sell to any other province. The same with Ontario, the same with British Columbia. So tax competition is important north-south as well as east-west. And as far as sales taxes are concerned, an important characteristic of Canada is that most of the major centers are not close to provincial boundaries. So Edmonton is a 3-hour drive from a boundary with another province, probably 6 hours from the United States. The only metropolitan area that is close to a provincial boundary is the Ottawa Hull area. For this reason, sales tax competition in terms of cross-border shopping is perhaps less important in Canada than in many other countries because the centers are in towards the center of the provinces, although they are close to U.S. cities. So the sales tax competition is often with adjacent states in the United States, not with other provinces. In other words, people in Vancouver, if they're thinking of shopping someplace else where prices are lower, they think of Seattle, not Calgary. So it's an important thing to bear in mind when we talk about sales taxes in Canada. Next slide, please. So This slide shows the sources of revenue for Canadian governments, all Canadian governments. Personal and corporate income taxes represent about 40% of total tax revenues. It's the largest and most important source of tax revenue. General sales taxes of various kinds, levied by both the federal and the state governments, is about 12%. The next largest tax are the property taxes, and then some payroll or Social Security contributions. But you see, sales taxes represent about 12%, 13% of total tax revenue. I will speak of the provincial local government sector because, as Professor McMillan emphasized in previous lecture, local governments are the creatures of the provinces. Unlike Brazil, local governments have no independent constitutional status. The provinces can form or destroy cities as they see fit, change the boundaries, change the responsibilities. So it's best to think of them as one type of unit. And you can see then that the provincial local government sector gets about 20%, 21% of its revenues from personal and corporate income taxes. Again, the provinces levy their own income tax rate and their own corporate tax rate. There are mechanisms for harmonization with the federal government. It has worked out reasonably well, could serve as a model for many countries in terms of federal or state levying income taxes. About 10% of revenues come from these sales taxes, 15% from property taxes, and payroll taxes and contributions to Social Security represent about 5%. The federal government also makes major transfers to the provinces, and in total they represent about 15% of total revenues for the provincial local sector, but that varies a great deal across provinces. In some provinces it's 30 or 40%. In my province it's 10% or less. In fact, probably my province could do without any transfers from the federal government, and maybe someday we will do without. Next slide, please. So about a third of the total personal income taxes collected by the provinces or provincial local sector. Half of the sales taxes are collected by the provinces. Again, there's no formula for sharing. It has just worked out that each level of government collects about half of the sales tax revenue. All of the property taxes are levied by the provinces or local governments. All of the payroll taxes are levied by the local government, provinces and local governments. About 13% of the contributions for Social Security plans. And as I perhaps also should emphasize, all of the royalties for renewable resources, oil and natural gas royalties, royalties for forestry products, etc., are levied by the provinces. Next slide, please. So in this slide, I'm trying to characterize the various sales taxes that are levied in Canada. Now, Canada has examples of some of the best models of tax harmonization and some examples of some of the worst tax harmonization. And the sales tax area currently is probably one of our worst areas of tax harmonization. So first of all, we have, I guess I will use the English acronyms. The GST, the goods and sales tax, levied by the federal government. It's a value-added tax levied on a destination basis at a 7% rate. And it's levied in all provinces except in the 3 Atlantic provinces where what is called the harmonized sales tax is levied. The harmonized sales tax, or HST, is levied in the 3 Atlantic provinces, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Newfoundland. It's levied at a 15% rate, and the revenue is shared among the provinces on the basis of estimates of the consumption in each province. So essentially 7% of the 15% goes to the federal government, and then the remaining 8% is allocated among the provinces according to some estimate of how they how much consumption occurs in each province. So this is an example of revenue sharing. The provinces that participate in this have little or no capacity to change the tax rate. They have to agree, all of them, on changing the tax rate, and agreements by 3 governments plus the federal government to change the tax rate are very unlikely to occur. The third system we have is the one that prevails in Quebec. It's called the Quebec sales tax. So in Quebec, there is a 7.5% value-added tax levied by the provincial government on almost the same tax base as the federal GST. In fact, the 7.5% rate is levied on the tax inclusive, or including the federal rate, so it's effectively an 8% rate. The government of Quebec administers both the QST, its own value-added tax, and the federal sales tax. So we have one state or province levying both taxes, and it remits or sends to the federal government the revenues that it collects on behalf of the federal government. As I'll show in a minute, the QST is levied on sales in Quebec, and they zero rate sales. They don't levy a QST on sales out of province, although they do levy the GST. In the other 5 provinces, a retail sales tax is imposed. A retail sales tax is a tax on the final sale of a good and some services by the provincial governments. It's levied at various rates in the provinces. We'll show you in a minute the slides. This tax is an old established sales tax, and similar taxes are levied by state governments in the United States, so you might be familiar with it from that context. One of the problems, as I will indicate later, is that between 1/3 and 50% of the retail sales tax base falls on inputs of business. In other words, the tax base is not just consumption of individuals, but also business inputs and capital goods. And this is a big problem because it causes a distortion in production decisions and reduces competitiveness of businesses in Canada, in those provinces where it is levied. The final tax, I will say, is the NDST, which I've called no damn sales tax. I was interested to see how this was translated into Portuguese, because Mary won't teach me any bad words in Portuguese, so now I think I might know one. Basically in Alberta we have no sales tax. Our population is adamant that we should never have a sales tax, and even though I have advocated we'd be better off with the sales tax than with personal income taxes, there's no scope for levying a sales tax in Canada soon. So the next slide simply summarizes then the situation. As you'll see, retail sales tax is basically in the West, except for our NDST. In Quebec, the dual value-added tax. In the East, the harmonized sales tax, except in the tiny island of Prince Edward Island, where they have a retail sales tax. Next slide, please. So in this slide, I try to summarize how this dual value-added tax works. So a merchant in Quebec would have to pay the 7% GST and a 7.5% QST on any sale to another consumer or business in Quebec. But if they make a sale to an Ontario resident, they only charge the 7% GST. So sales to customers out of province are only charged the federal tax, the 7% GST. Likewise, in Ontario, if they make a sale to a consumer in Ontario, they charge 7% GST plus the 8% retail sales tax. If they make a sale to someone or a business in Quebec, they just charge the 7% GST. However, if they make a sale to someone or business in New Brunswick, they charge the 15% HST. So in this way, the administration is relatively simple in that they only have to know where the customer is located and whether they should charge the RST or QST if they're a provincial government, or if they have to charge the HST if they are in the Atlantic provinces. There is a problem that, of course, if that final customer, for example, a sale from Quebec to Ontario, if the final customer in Ontario is not a business but a final consumer, they will avoid the Ontario sales tax. So there is some problem of tax avoidance. But again, except in the Ottawa area, the distances are usually thought to be so great as cross-border shopping, unless it's something like an automobile, is not really a big issue. And they have special measures for trying to enforce automobile taxes, collection of taxes on automobiles. Next slide, please. So our provincial sales tax rates have changed over time. This slide shows how the rates in the various provinces have changed. You see around 1980 there was a great deal of variation in tax rates, and over time this variation has been substantially reduced. So now, except for Prince Edward Island, that small island province that has a high rate of 10%, the rates are between 7% and 8%. Next slide, please. This slide shows how much sales tax a family of four earning $75,000 Canadian, about $60,000 US, would pay. And the important point I want to make here is that there's a lot of variation then, of course, on the sales tax burden. But comparing Quebec and Ontario, the family in Ontario pays $500 less than the family in Quebec, even though the tax rates are the same or very similar, close to 8%. 8% in Ontario, equivalent to 8% in Quebec. Why does the family in Quebec pay more, or why does the family in Ontario pay less? It's because in Quebec, the value-added tax taxes a full range of services. For example, services of lawyers. Whereas in Ontario, I don't know, probably lawyers do not charge our retail sales tax. And then also in Ontario, a lot of this retail sales tax is imposed on businesses, business inputs. So the actual tax that falls on people or families is relatively small. So because of the base of the RST, the retail sales tax, doesn't include services, all services, and includes business inputs, it appears to a family that they pay less RST, less sales tax, than they would in Quebec. And this creates a problem, because if we wanted to harmonize the system, the government of Ontario would have to increase taxes on this family in Ontario by $500. You don't have to be a politician to know that increasing the tax burden on a middle-income family by $500 is not a winning election strategy. In fact, would probably almost guarantee your government being defeated in an election. So how do we change the system, and why do we want to change the system? The next slide is from a study by economists at the Department of Finance that calculated the efficiency cost or distortionary cost of various taxes. The one I want to draw your attention to is the one at the extreme left, which is the cost, distortionary cost of the retail sales tax that falls on business inputs. So they calculate that $1 of retail sales tax actually reduces output in the economy by $1.30, compared with a value-added tax that only reduces output by 10 cents. In other words, if we could switch $1 of tax revenue from the retail sales tax that falls on business to a value-added tax, we would save $1.20 in output, or we would have $1.20 more in income consumption. So this would represent an enormous efficiency gain if we could shift from these taxes that fall on business inputs to the GST, QST that just falls on consumption. So there's an enormous opportunity for improvement in resource allocation if we can shift from retail sales taxes to value-added taxes, impose the dual value-added tax as they have in Quebec. So I'm going to, on the next slide, I propose a reform which I will outline very briefly, and that is that the 5 provinces that levy RSTs, retail sales taxes, could switch to a revenue-neutral value-added tax. And again, Ontario would have to levy a value-added tax of about 8% in order to collect the same amount of revenue. I propose that the federal government would make this possible politically by simultaneously lowering its GST by 2 percentage points to 5%. So then, if the federal government lowered its tax rate by 2 percentage points, a family would be more or less equally well off under the two systems. They would have a lower total tax rate from the federal government, even though the provincial tax effectively would be higher. And this tax reform would be essentially then revenue neutral for the provinces and impose roughly the same tax burden on individual families. The next slide, please. And this shows that there would be an efficiency gain of about $6 billion. Again, efficiency gain is kind of general. It would probably show itself in higher wages and salaries for Canadians generally, because our businesses would be more competitive, they could export more, produce more, etc. Although the federal government would lose about $9 billion because of the reduction in GST, it would probably gain about $2 billion in extra taxes on the increase in wages and salaries and so on. So there's an opportunity for a welfare improving tax reform that has basically a benefit cost ratio of $1.67. In other words, the benefits exceed the cost by a ratio of 1.67. So in tax reform in Canada, as in many places, requires coordination of the federal and provincial governments, and this is an example of this. So in conclusion, last slide, please. I'll have to say that the dual value-added tax system that has evolved in Quebec not only works, but it's necessary to make it work in the rest of Canada, or there would be big advantages in having it work in the rest of Canada. This approach, the dual VAT system, is better than the harmonized tax system that is in effect in Atlantic Canada. And if we could move to this system, we could reduce or eliminate these highly distortionary taxes. How relevant this is for Brazil, I cannot really comment on. I spent a year here last year, and the only thing I learned is just how complicated the Brazilian tax system is. So the relevance of this reform and this way of thinking about taxes for Brazil, I'm not so sure I can explain that, or would say it has a great deal of relevance. But I'd like to thank you at least for your attention and giving me this opportunity to talk about my country's tax systems. Thank you.